Your phone lights up in the dark, a simple sound, a small vibration on the table, nothing dramatic. Someone wrote to you. Maybe it is a friend, maybe a relative, maybe someone you actually like. The message is not even aggressive. It could be warm, casual, ordinary. A few harmless words floating across a screen, and yet something in you tightens. You see it. You register it. You know you should answer. It would take less than a minute, maybe less than 10 seconds. But instead of replying, you put the phone face down. You tell yourself you will do it later, in 10 minutes, in an hour, tonight, tomorrow morning when your mind is clearer. And then the message begins to grow inside you. Not on the screen, inside you, like a small pressure, a weight, a quiet debt. And the longer you do not answer, the heavier it gets. From the outside, people usually explain this in the simplest possible way. They say these people are careless, cold, rude, socially lazy, attention seekers, emotionally immature, or maybe just strange. But that explanation is too convenient, too shallow, too clean. Because for many people, not answering messages is not a simple habit. It is not just poor manners. It is not always indifference. Sometimes it is a psychological event, a tiny collision between the outer world and the inner one, a moment where contact feels heavier than it should, where response feels like exposure, where one innocent notification touches something much deeper than conversation. And that is what this video is about, not the obvious explanation, the hidden one. Today you're going to see why some people do not just delay replies, but almost experience messages as pressure. Why a small digital interaction can trigger tension, resistance, guilt, fatigue, or even a strange feeling of being cornered. You're going to see 6 deep traits, 6 hidden psychological patterns that often live inside people who do not like answering messages. And by the end, you may stop seeing this behavior as emptiness and start seeing it for what it often really is, a defense, a burden, a silent internal structure. If this kind of psychology speaks to you, leave a like, subscribe, and let us go deeper. The first trait is hidden claustrophobia of access. Some people do not experience a message as a message. They experience it as entry. For them, communication is not neutral. It is not just words arriving from one person to another. It is access, a small opening through which someone enters their time, their attention, their emotional field, their mental room. And the reason this matters is because many people have never learned to feel truly protected inside their own boundaries. In psychology, boundaries are not just social skills. They are part of how the self organizes safety. If your inner boundaries are weak, inconsistent, or were repeatedly ignored in the past, even small demands can feel invasive. Not because the other person is doing something wrong, but because your nervous system is interpreting contact as penetration. That is why sometimes you can like someone and still not want to answer them. That is why you can read a message from a person you care about and still feel resistance before even opening it. Because the fear is not always about the content. Often it is about what follows, the expectation, the thread, the continuation, the invisible line now connecting you to another person who may want something from you emotionally, mentally, or practically. You tell yourself it is just one reply. But your body does not believe that. Your body feels the whole chain. If I answer now, they may continue. If they continue, I will have to stay engaged. If I stay engaged, my energy is no longer fully mine. And suddenly, one harmless message feels like a door you do not want to open. This is especially common in people who have spent years feeling too available to everyone. People who were expected to respond, explain, calm, reassure, accommodate. People whose inner world was treated like public property. For them, silence is not always avoidance. Sometimes silence is the only place where they still feel ownership over themselves. Of course there is a price. The person on the other side may feel ignored. Relationships may cool. Misunderstandings grow. Guilt accumulates. And the person who stays silent often suffers too, because they are not actually free. They are just hiding inside a shrinking room. But what looks like coldness is often overcrowding. Sometimes a delayed reply is not distance from you. It is an attempt to get back to oneself. The second trait is emotional cost per interaction. Some people do not dislike communication. They dislike how much it takes from them. This is where surface culture gets everything wrong. We live in a world that treats messaging like breathing. Constant, instant, effortless. You write, you answer, you react, you move on. The process is supposed to feel light, casual, almost automatic, but for some people, it is never automatic. Each reply requires a kind of internal labor that others do not see. They do not just answer, they calculate tone, they anticipate interpretation, they edit themselves. They check whether they sound too cold, too eager, too dry, too intense, too late, too formal, too informal. Their mind does not produce a sentence, it produces an emotional risk assessment. What should have taken 10 seconds becomes a miniature performance, and this is not always vanity or overthinking in the shallow sense. Often it comes from a history of misattunement. Maybe their words were often misunderstood. Maybe they learned early that the wrong tone could create conflict. Maybe affection had to be measured carefully. Maybe emotional mistakes carried consequences. Over time, the brain learns that expression is not free. Expression is dangerous. Precision becomes a survival strategy. So a simple reply becomes work. You can see it in ordinary scenes. Someone sends you a friendly message asking how you are. And instead of feeling warmth, you feel a wave of heaviness. Not because you dislike them, but because now you have to choose how honest to be. If you say fine, it is false. If you tell the truth, it becomes a conversation. If you keep it short, you look distant. If you open up, you may regret it. So you stare at the screen, trapped not by the message itself, but by the number of invisible emotional doors it opens. People often say, if you cared, you would answer. But caring is sometimes exactly what makes the reply harder. Because the more emotionally aware a person is, the more they feel the weight of communication. The more they understand that words are never just words. They carry tone, timing, subtext, obligation, memory, possibility. And when every interaction feels expensive, avoidance becomes tempting. The tragedy is that others see only absence. They do not see the hidden cost. What looks like low effort is often emotional overexertion happening in silence. The third trait is the fear of unfinished human contracts. A message is rarely just a message. Very often it is an opening of a contract. That contract may be tiny. It may last only a few minutes, but psychologically it still exists. Once contact begins, something is set in motion. There is a rhythm now, a thread, a social pulse. And for certain people, this is precisely what creates stress. Because they do not like starting what they may not have the energy to continue. This pattern has deep roots in responsibility and guilt. Some people carry an exaggerated sense of relational duty. They do not know how to interact lightly. If they reply, they feel responsible for the whole emotional field that follows. They feel they should stay present, answer properly, maintain warmth, not disappear mid-conversation, not hurt the other person, not create confusion. In other words, they do not experience communication as a moment. They experience it as commitment. And when your energy is unstable, your focus fragmented, or your emotional reserves low, commitment becomes frightening. You see this in the way some people postpone replies until they feel they can answer well. They do not want to send a half-hearted line. They do not want to leave a weak impression. They do not want to start a conversation from a depleted place. So they wait for the right moment. But the right moment rarely comes. Because the more they wait, the more the message becomes contaminated with guilt. Now it is no longer just a reply. Now it is a late reply. Now it requires explanation. Now it carries shame, and shame makes action even harder. So the silence grows. This is one of the cruelest loops in human psychology. The thing you avoid because it feels heavy becomes heavier because you avoided it. And after a while, the person is no longer avoiding the message. They are avoiding the version of themselves that the unanswered message now represents. They open the chat, feel the sting, and close it again. From the outside, that looks careless. From the inside, it feels like standing in front of a task that has become morally charged. Many of these people are not casual avoiders. They are burdened people. People who feel relational debt too intensely. People who would rather disappear than participate badly. People who treat every thread like a promise, and every promise like weight. The problem is that life does not wait for you to feel perfectly ready. Human contact is messy, partial, unfinished. If you only answer when you can do it flawlessly, silence will become your permanent language. Sometimes the person who does not answer is not escaping connection. They are afraid of failing it. The fourth trait is nervous system rebellion against constant availability. Not every psychological pattern begins in thought. Some begin in the body. There are people whose minds say, answer the message, but whose nervous systems say, no more, not now, not another demand, not another signal, not another little hook pulling your attention outward. Modern messaging culture quietly normalized a form of permanent low-level exposure. You're always reachable, always visible, always potentially interruptible. Someone can access you at any hour, from any place, with almost no friction. And while this seems normal, the human nervous system was not built for endless micro-contacts with no real closure. For some people, this creates a background state of silent agitation. Every notification becomes a small activation, a tiny rise in alertness, a momentary break in internal continuity. Over time, especially in people who are already anxious, overstimulated, or mentally exhausted, these little activations begin to feel hostile, not because the phone is evil, not because the people are bad, but because the organism is tired. This is why some people can spend hours doing difficult work, but feel strangely overwhelmed by 3 unread messages. The work, at least, is coherent. It has structure. It stays in one channel. Messages do not. They split attention. They demand social presence. They create micro-transitions between worlds. 1 second you're in your thoughts, the next you're in someone else's mood, question, urgency, joke, need, or expectation. That constant switching drains more than most people realize. Neuroscience has been telling us for years that attention is not infinitely flexible. Each shift has a cost. Each interruption leaves residue. And when you already live close to your emotional limit, even ordinary communication can start to feel like an assault of fragments. So what do? You stop opening messages. You mute chats. You look at the screen and feel irritation before you even know why. You tell yourself you need peace, but what you really need is recovery from invisible overstimulation. Of course, there is danger here too, because once the nervous system begins associating messages with depletion, avoidance becomes reinforcing. Silence feels like relief. Relief teaches repetition. Repetition becomes habit, and habit becomes identity. Soon the person is no longer saying, I need rest. They are saying, I am just the kind of person who hates messaging. But beneath that identity, there is often a body that has been left unprotected for too long. What looks antisocial is sometimes neurological self-defense. The 5th trait is the wish to exist without performance. This one cuts deeper. Many people do not hate messages because of time. They hate them because messages force them into a version of themselves. Social interaction, even in tiny digital form, often requires performance. You must choose an emotional register. You must sound like someone. Friendly, stable, interested, funny, soft, polite, measured, adult. You cannot just send raw existence. You must package yourself into a legible form. And some people are tired of being legible. This is especially true for those whose inner lives are far more complex than what everyday communication allows. People who feel too much, think too much, fluctuate too much, carry moods they cannot explain, or simply do not always have a clean, socially acceptable version of themselves available on demand. A message arrives asking, how are you? And suddenly the person feels the violence of simplification. How are you is supposed to be easy. But what if you are tired, detached, overstimulated, disappointed, numb, secretly sad, unable to explain yourself, and unwilling to turn your inner weather into a neat little sentence that keeps other people comfortable? So you delay. Not because you are dramatic, because you are resisting reduction. There is a quiet dignity in this, but also pain, because the wish to avoid performance can slowly become the inability to participate at all. The more a person feels false in ordinary interaction, the more they retreat from interaction itself. They start to believe that unless they can be fully authentic, they should remain silent. But human connection rarely gives us the luxury of total authenticity. Much of social life runs on partial signals, small bridges, rough approximations. Still, you can understand the resistance. Some people have spent their whole lives performing acceptability, smiling when empty, reassuring when hurt, being pleasant while disconnected from themselves. For them, silence is not always absence. Sometimes it is the only place where they do not have to act. This is why unanswered messages can carry a strange moral ambiguity. On one level, yes, someone is left waiting. But on another level, a human being is trying not to betray their own inner state one more time. The cost, however, is loneliness. because the world cannot love a person it never gets to meet, even imperfectly. Still, behind many delayed replies is a quiet protest. Sometimes silence is the last refuge of a self that is tired of performing life in a socially acceptable tone. The sixth trait is deep fear of emotional capture. This is where the whole picture becomes darker and more honest. For some people, answering messages does not feel difficult because of laziness, fatigue, or bad habits alone. It feels dangerous because contact has historically led to entanglement. They learned somewhere, often early, that once another person gets emotional access, things become complicated. There may be pressure, neediness, control, conflict, draining expectations, manipulation disguised as affection, obligation disguised as closeness. They learned that it is easier to prevent emotional capture than to escape it once it begins. So they become cautious at the level of the smallest opening. A reply is not just a reply. It is permission. It is signal. It is availability. It is a possible invitation into territory they are not sure they can regulate. This creates a very specific kind of avoidant behavior. The person may crave intimacy, but fear the loss of autonomy that intimacy seems to bring. They may want to be understood, but dread being consumed. They may miss people deeply, while still ignoring them for days. This contradiction confuses everyone, including the person living it. How can you want connection and resist it at the same time? Because the nervous system is holding two truths at once. I need people. People cost me myself. That is one of the central conflicts in modern psychological life. The hunger for closeness mixed with the fear of being swallowed by it. When such a person sees a message, especially from someone emotionally significant, the reaction can be surprisingly intense. Their mind starts running ahead. What do they want? How much energy will this take? Will I disappoint them? Will they become upset? Will they expect more? Will I end up trapped in another emotional corridor I cannot exit cleanly? So silence becomes an attempt to stay unclaimed. Of course, the irony is brutal. The more someone protects themselves from emotional capture by withdrawing, the more they risk creating the very thing they fear: unstable, painful, confusing bonds. Because what wounds relationships is often not lack of feeling, but lack of steady presence. Still, once you see this pattern, many things begin to make sense. The inconsistency, the warm reply followed by disappearance, the genuine affection mixed with distance, the strong need for solitude after even meaningful contact. This is not always a person who does not care. Sometimes it is a person whose history taught them that every open door may become a cage, and that is why the old explanation fails. The idea that people who do not answer messages are simply rude, detached, arrogant, or unserious misses almost everything that matters, because by now you can see the deeper portrait. Sometimes the person who does not answer is protecting boundaries they never learned to trust. Sometimes they are paying an emotional cost for every sentence. Sometimes they are afraid of beginning what they cannot sustain. Sometimes their nervous system is already too full of interruptions. Sometimes they are exhausted by having to perform a manageable version of themselves. And sometimes they are trying, in the clumsiest way possible, not to be captured by a kind of closeness that once cost them too much. None of this makes the silence easy for other people. None of this magically removes the hurt of being left unread. And it should not. Psychological understanding is not the same as moral exemption. People can have deep reasons and still create pain. They can be wounded and still wound others. They can be psychologically complex and still need to grow. But growth begins in truth, not in shame. Because shame only repeats the pattern. It tells the person they are defective, selfish, cold, broken. And once someone starts seeing themselves that way, silence becomes even more loaded, even more contaminated, even more difficult to change. Understanding does something else. It says this behavior is not random. It has structure. It has memory. It has logic. And when behavior has logic, it can be faced. Maybe you recognized yourself in this video. Maybe you thought you were simply bad at people, bad at replying, bad at keeping contact alive. Maybe you've been carrying quiet guilt for years, watching messages pile up like evidence against your character. But maybe the truth is more precise than that. Maybe you are not empty. Maybe you are defended. Maybe you are not indifferent. Maybe you are overloaded. Maybe you are not incapable of closeness. Maybe you learn to associate closeness with cost. That does not mean silence should rule your life. It does not mean every unread message is sacred self-protection. Sometimes avoidance is still avoidance. Sometimes the thing that once protected you is now isolating you. Sometimes the defense became a prison, and the longer you stay inside it, the more your world shrinks into something controlled but lonely. That is the real danger. Not that you answer too little, but that one day you become so adapted to distance that warmth starts to feel unnatural. So the task is not to condemn yourself and not to romanticize your withdrawal. The task is to understand what your silence has been doing for you and what it has been taking from you. Because once you understand the function, you can begin choosing instead of only reacting. You can learn that a reply is not always surrender, that access can be limited without complete disappearance, that connection can exist without total performance, that not every message is a demand for your soul, that presence can be partial, human, imperfect, and still real. And most importantly, you can begin separating the present from the old emotional laws that still live inside you. The laws that say contact means pressure, that response means captivity, that availability means loss of self, that if you cannot do connection perfectly, you should not do it at all. Those laws may feel intimate because you have lived inside them for so long, but they are not the whole truth about you. You're not just your delays, not just your unread chats, not just the guilt that rises when the screen lights up. You are a person with an inner architecture, a pattern, a history, a way of protecting what felt vulnerable long before anyone else noticed. And once you see that architecture clearly, something changes. The shame begins to loosen. The confusion becomes language. The behavior stops looking like a personal flaw and starts revealing itself as a map of your inner world. That is the point where real change becomes possible. Not when someone accuses you hard enough, not when you force yourself into fake social efficiency, but when you finally understand what your silence has been trying to save. Because the person who does not answer messages is often not hiding from people. They are hiding from pressure, performance, overstimulation, guilt, and the old fear that one small opening can cost them more than they can afford. And that is why the truth is heavier than the stereotype. Sometimes the unread message is not a sign of disrespect. Sometimes it is the shadow of a nervous system that learned to protect itself by disappearing. And the strongest thing you can remember is this: silence is not always the absence of feeling. Very often, it is what feeling looks like when it has nowhere safe to go. Odpraw w tekstowym dokumencie, by